happy?
Well, apparently it's live. You've got to go to the
Science Festival page. Or
there's a
winter thingy, an embedded thingy, is there? I'm not going to slow it down by doing it from here.
no, not at all. No, just
No, as long as you're happy, that's fine.
I think just about.
Oh yeah, that's perfect.
If I just touch that, it's just. I better not touch it. I'm just going to leave it as it is. It's working.
Yeah.
I'll log on to this. I'll just use the guest one for now. Connect, and then we'll go to. Right, here we go. This is the page.
Oh yeah. Excellent.
There it is.
It's a Facebook Live.
There it is.
Excellent.
Great. It's quite a wide angle. Enough, yeah. Good. This is it. What is going on now?
I should have zoomed in, but I don't know whether I don't know once it started.
I don't think it is possible very often.
No.
Depends on the camera.
Yeah.
I know that it's on this one not possible. I could do it on my big camera, but it didn't take it this time with me because it was like a monster. Too heavy. Yeah, we need to share it on the fair, on Science Festival website. Definitely. Later tonight.
Everybody, you can hear me, good. Welcome to our last talk of the evening. bit of housekeeping. I think most of you have been here for earlier lectures, so talked, so you'll know. First of all, the mobile phones, please, and the fire exits are here, and at the back. So our next speaker is Professor Dave Goulson, and his name is one that's reverberated around the world of conservation and biology, and especially bumblebees and other insects, pollinating insects, for quite a number of years. He's written a large number of scientific papers and books. He founded the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and he's also written some best-selling books, which have inspired me and many other people to take much more notice of the little insects, especially the bumblebees that are all around us. So, welcome, Dave Goulson.
Thanks very much for the introduction and the invitation to be here. My first time in Orkney, and it's treated me to some traditional weather. Absolutely French. So today I'm going to talk to you about bees, primarily bumblebees, but I'll mention other insects too. But I wanted to start off quite gently by just introducing you to the diversity of bees, because I think many members of the public think there's only one or two species of bee. They use the word bee as being synonymous with the honeybee, the creature on the left, the animal that we keep in a hive and we get honey from. And that is the most widespread and abundant bee in the world. But there are 20,000 species of bee in the world, and it's rather sad that most people are completely unaware of the existence of most of these beasties. So I thought I'd just start by showing you some pictures of some nice bees, nothing too taxing. So here we go. So first of all, this is a leafcutter bee. This is a common British species found all over the mainland. I don't think, sadly, they're found here. It's one of many species of bee which are solitary, so actually I'll just skip back for a second. The honeybee, of course, is famous because it lives in a hive with a queen and maybe 40, 50, 60,000 workers who are all daughters of the queen. They're all sisters working to look after their mum. But the honeybee is actually a really weird and unusual bee in having these giant colonies. The bumblebees that I study have much smaller colonies, but they do still have a queen and workers. But actually the large majority of bee species live on their own. They're solitary insects. The female bee just makes her own nest. And this leafcutter bee is one of those. It's called a leafcutter bee because it likes to nest in holes, and it lines them with little snippets of leaves. And it very often takes those little semicircles of leaves from lilac and roses in people's gardens, and they get a little bit annoyed and wonder what's making these big holes in the leaves of their plants. But it's this rather sweet little bee. I don't think you get these here either, sadly. I should have checked exactly what species you do get here. This is another widespread species in the southern half of Britain. It's called the hairy-footed flower bee. It's another solitary bee. It's called the hairy-footed flower bee for obvious reasons. The males, and only the males, have these sort of long hairs just on their middle legs. And no one really knows exactly what they're for, but when they're mating with the female, they use their hairy feet to stroke her face, and she seems to quite like it. So that's the hairy-footed flower bee. There are bees that don't look much like bees at all. This is a type of cuckoo bee. It is a bee. Most people would mistake it for a wasp, but it's a bee, but it's a bee that's become a parasite on other bees, and there are a lot of species that have done this. So this is a parasite of a solitary bee. It looks for the nests of a solitary bee, which in this case are holes in the ground, and it waits until the female bee is out collecting food for her offspring, and the cuckoo bee nips in and lays its own egg, just like the bird, hence the name obviously. And the offspring of the cuckoo bee hatches from its egg very quickly, and it has specially large and sharp mandibles, specifically for the purpose of murdering the host's offspring, and then it eats all their food. So It's a little bit mean, but it's all part of life's rich tapestry, I guess. You shouldn't think less of them for that. If you go beyond Europe, there are some really amazing, our own bees are beautiful and wonderful, but I couldn't resist putting in a few of the world's more spectacular bees as well. This is a thing called the blue-banded armadillo, which you get in Australia. This is a blue carpenter bee, a really big beast that lives in China. I've never seen these, I must confess, but one day I'll hope I do. And then there's this, which is an orchid bee. There are actually lots of species of orchid bee that live in Central and South America. They're tropical species. They're called orchid bees because the males visit orchids, not for the pollen or the nectar, but to collect the floral scents, which they stuff into their swollen, hollow legs. And they create their own kind of floral bouquet. And then when they find a female orchid bee, they waft their legs at her and hope that she's impressed by the smell that they've created. If you get interested in bees and want to try identifying them for yourself, one of the first confusing obstacles you'll come across is that there are quite a lot of insects pretending to be bees that aren't bees. The reason they do that is because bees have a sting, or at least female bees have a sting, and therefore lots of predators avoid trying to eat a bee because they don't want to get stung. And so there are lots of other insects that have evolved to mimic bees. This really isn't one of them. This is pretty blatantly a fly, but sadly the publishers of the book Bees of the World thought it was the perfect picture to put on the front cover, and legend has it that they printed 4,000 copies before they showed any to the authors. And I can imagine we're not best pleased. But there are some flies and other insects too, such as beetles and so on, that have evolved to be really good bee mimics. This is a much better one. This is a type of hoverfly. And on the right is I think, the species it's pretending to be, or something close. So that's a bumblebee over there. This is a hoverfly. It's very distantly related to a bee. It has no sting, it's completely harmless, but it's superficially very, very similar for good reason. Okay, and then there are the bumblebees. These are my kind of speciality, the one I study. And these are the commonest of the wild bees you find on Orkney, in fact throughout the temperate northern hemisphere. Bumblebees tend to be abundant. They are social bees, as I said, but they're very different to the honeybee. A honeybee colony lives for many years, but a bumblebee colony is quite short-lived, and it started in the spring single-handedly by a queen bee coming out of hibernation. So the queens sleep through the winter, and then in the south as early as February or March, you get the first queens coming out of hibernation, and then the queens are bigger than the rest of the bumblebees. And you see them, first of all, hungrily feeding because they've been asleep for months and months and they're starving. And then you see them flying backwards and forwards, low to the ground, particularly in meadows and lawns and so on. And they're looking for holes, and if they find a hole, they'll land and walk down inside. And they're looking for a nest site. Ideally, they're looking for a nice, dark, cosy, dry place where they can build their nest, where it's safe from predators and out of the rain and so on. And ideally, what they want in there is an old, abandoned rodent nest that they can use as insulation to help keep their brood warm. And if they find all of that, the queen will then go off and collect some pollen. She makes a little pellet of pollen. She covers it in wax, and then she lays her eggs on it, and then she sits on it, presses her tummy against it, and she shivers to generate heat. And she incubates her brood, just like a bird incubates her eggs, to keep them warm so they develop quickly. And eventually they hatch into little grubs that she then has to rush off and get more food for, so the queen is frantically busy for a few weeks until those offspring become adults, and they then take over all the foraging. And those would be workers, the first offspring she produces. They're all daughters, just identical but smaller versions of their mum. And she then never leaves her nest again. The nest grows through the spring. She lays more and more eggs until there may be 300-400 workers in the bumblebee nest by the middle of summer. And then it switches to producing males and new queens. And they fly off from the nest and they mate. The young queens, they only mate once with one male in their whole life. And as soon as they've mated, they burrow into the ground and wait right through to the next spring. And that's all the males do. Their job is done. It's rather sad, actually. There are about 7 times as many males born as young queens, and given that the male's only job in life is to mate, and that each queen only mates once, means that 6 out of 7 male bumblebees never get to do the one thing that they were born to do, as it were. Anyway, they die off, the old queen dies, the old workers die, and the nests sort of fizzle out at about this time of year. It's a slightly sad time of year if you're a bee botherer like me, because it's kind of, there's just a few tired bees left, kind of waiting to die at the moment. Anyway, the cycle will start again in the spring when the young queens come out, hopefully. So, this is a useful map if you were planning a holiday to see lots of bumblebees, which you probably wouldn't, but anyway. So this shows you how many species of bumblebee you can find in different parts of the world. So the numbers, which you probably can't read, so apologies for that, but the numbers tell you how many species are found in each square. But the colours correspond to how big the number is. So these dark colours show you the hot spots for the most bumblebee species in the world. The reason I'm showing you this is because it's very different to the map you would get if I was showing you the same kind of thing for butterflies or grasshoppers or dragonflies or almost any other type of insect, which tend to be more abundant in the tropics, in South America, in Africa or wherever. Bumblebees are unusual in that they're specialists in living in cold places. We think they first evolved somewhere about here, which is still the global hotspot. There's number 60, if you can read it, just there, somewhere in the eastern Himalayas, and we think that's where bumblebees first appeared about 30 million years ago. I should say, by way of background, bees first evolved about 120 million years ago, so that was way back in the age of the dinosaurs, and they survived the cataclysm, the meteor strike that wiped out the dinosaurs. But bumblebees came later, a mere 30 million years ago, still an awful long time before us. And they appeared in the Himalayas, we think, and they spread out westwards to us in Europe, and eastwards into Siberia, and some of them crossed over into Alaska and spread down through the Americas, but there aren't terribly many of them down there. Most of them, the real diversity is in cool parts of the northern hemisphere. And that's because, as I say, these are specialists in living in cold places, which is odd, because insects generally are thermophilic. They like warmth, they need warmth to be active, to fly around, but bumblebees are different. They have a trick, which is they produce their own heat. So I remember being taught at school by my biology teacher that insects are cold-blooded, that only birds and mammals are warm-blooded. So we generate our own heat internally and we regulate our body temperature. So it's usually warmer than the ambient temperature. Whereas insects, like butterflies, the only way they can get warm enough to fly about is by sitting in the sun and absorbing the heat of the sun. They can't generate their own heat. So they like to live in warm places. But bumblebees are different, and you can see this. So this is an infrared picture of a bumblebee. And so that's the thorax of the bee, there's the antennae and the head sort of tucked under. And that's where the heat is coming from. It's because the thorax is full of flight muscles. And when a bumblebee buzzes her wings, she flaps her wings at about 200 times a second, which generates lots of heat from those muscles, which is kept in by the furry coat. You try flapping your arms 200 times a second while wearing a furry coat, you'll get hot. It's exactly what they do. And it enables bumblebees to thrive in places like this, where most insects struggle, but for bumblebees it's fine. They can actually have an internal body temperature that can be 30 degrees centigrade warmer than the surrounding air, which is a useful trick for, and some species live right up into the Arctic Circle. There's a species called Bombus polaris, for example. But it comes at a cost because it's enormously energetically expensive to produce lots of heat and maintain a high body temperature when you're a small insect. Well, big for an insect, but small compared to us. And so bumblebees need lots of nectar-rich flowers to fuel their activity, and if they don't find enough flowers, they're in trouble. Someone once calculated that a running man burns the calories in a Mars bar in about an hour of running, which is quite a depressing statistic if you're running to lose weight. But if you were a man-sized bumblebee, you could burn the calories in a Mars bar in 30 seconds of flying. It would also be quite fun if such a thing existed, but anyway. So they need lots of flowers, and if they don't find enough, they're in trouble. And actually, my earliest memory of bumblebees, from when I was about 7 years old, is finding some bumblebees that had run out of energy. They were sitting on flowers, they got caught out in the cold, and they didn't seem able to fly. It's something you may have seen yourself, sometimes happens. They haven't got enough energy to warm themselves up, and they can't therefore fly to find more flowers and so on. And I thought I'd rescue them, so I picked up these wet bumblebees and took them into the house. And we have one of these old electric cookers that takes hours to warm up, so I put it on the bottom setting and put these bees on the hot plate with a little tissue blanket over them. And then I got bored waiting for them to warm up and kind of wandered off. And then suddenly I heard my mum shouting and there was smoke and the bees were on fire and they all died. I sometimes think my subsequent career has been trying to make up for my early bee learning. Anyway, so they need lots of flowers. Hang on, what's going on? And they visit lots of flowers, and that makes them really good pollinators. About 87% of all plant species on Earth need pollinated by some kind of animal. Sometimes it's not an insect, usually it's an insect, and more often than not it's some kind of bee. And 75% of all the crops that we humans grow in the world need pollinating one way or another. These are a few examples. This just shows, so bees are specialists at collecting pollen and nectar. There are many insects that drink nectar to fuel their flight, like butterflies and hoverflies and things. But bees also collect the pollen to feed to their offspring, and so a bee eats pollen or nectar throughout its life, unlike a butterfly. And so bees are masters at collecting pollen, and this one's probably got a bit carried away, and he's got so much pollen on it, it can barely take off. But it illustrates nicely how good they are at carrying pollen. They're covered in fur, and not only are they covered in fur, but the fur on a bee is branched, the hairs actually branch as they go along, which helps the pollen to stick to them. So, 75% of the crops that we grow, it equates to about a third of the food that we eat by weight, depends upon pollinators. If we didn't have our pollinators, then our shops that are normally so full of lovely fruit and vegetables would look rather bare. And to be honest, we simply couldn't feed everybody in the world. There are, 7.4 billion of us, and there's going to be 10 or 12 billion of us before too long. And we simply couldn't feed everybody if we didn't have pollinators to ensure crops of all the different crops that need them. And so we should be worried that some pollinators at least are in decline. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. This is a local speciality. This is the great yellow bumblebee, which used to be found all over Britain. So that shows you its distribution in the first half of the 20th century. But it's declined a lot, so by the second half of the 20th century, most of the populations in the south had gone, and today it's confined to the far north and west of Scotland. Orkney is one of the very few places where you still have a good population of this species. It's extinct in England and Wales. And it's not alone by any means. Britain's lost 3 species of bumblebee altogether, not just declined a lot, but actually gone extinct in Britain. And many other species have disappeared from a variety of European countries. Let me give you another example from further afield. This is Franklin's bumblebee. This is a North American species that used to live, to give you your bearings, this is the West Pacific coast of the United States, this is Oregon, and this is California. And this is where this bee used to live, the red dots. But it went into rapid decline in the late 1990s, and it hasn't been seen at all since 2006. And we think that Franklin's bumblebee is now the first bumblebee that we know of to go globally extinct. It's pretty certain there are none left. And it's kind of sad in a way that the only picture I can show you of one has got a pin in it, because digital cameras weren't invented quite enough for someone to take a picture of one on the wing. I don't know why that matters, but anyway, poor Franklin's bumblebee. And it isn't just bumblebees or bees that are declining. Evidence is accumulating that insects are declining. Of course, wildlife is declining too, generally. The middle part of this talk is rather depressing, sorry, but it gets a bit more cheerful at the end. So, These are data from Germany. There was a study that came out in late 2017 that I was involved in, which involved malaise trapping of insects on nature reserves all across Germany. This is a malaise trap, this funny looking thing up here, looks a bit like a tent, and it catches flying insects. And this graph shows you the daily weight, the biomass of insects caught in traps between 1989 and 2014, so that's a 26-year period, and it's pretty obvious that something's happening. There's this really dramatic 75%, 3/4 of the insects have gone, seemingly, right across Germany in just 26 years. And we don't know for sure whether the same thing is happening in Britain or other countries. We have other lines of evidence that suggest that certainly our insects are declining. It isn't just bees, we've got good data for butterflies and moths and so on. And they're all broadly in decline, but most of the evidence we have suggests that the declines aren't quite this rapid, but nonetheless there seems to be a huge problem. Something is causing our insects to disappear. So what is it? Well, for bumblebees, there's probably been more research and discussion about why bumblebees are declining than perhaps any other group of insects. And most people agree that there's more than one driver of what's going on. There's at least 3, and probably a few others as well, but there's only 3 I'm going to mention. Disease and loss of habitat, and the effects of pesticides are probably the 3 biggest ones so far. And I'm just going to say a tiny bit about the first couple and a little bit more about pesticides. So firstly, bees naturally have lots of diseases and parasites and pathogens, all sorts of weird and wonderful things, and that's part of nature, just like the cuckoo bee. You shouldn't worry about that. But unfortunately, we've made life much harder for bees by accidentally moving their parasites around the world with honeybees, and then more recently with commercial bumblebees, which are reared for tomato pollination. But mainly it's the movement of honeybee colonies. We've taken honeybees everywhere in the world. They're on in every country of the world. And unfortunately, when we move honeybees, we very often accidentally take honeybee diseases. And sadly, they're not just diseases of honeybees. They're bee diseases or insect diseases that will happily transmit to wild bumblebees or even sometimes hoverflies and so on. And there are a number of examples. Just to give you one, there's an Asian bee diarrhea called Nosema cerani, which we've accidentally transported from Asia all over the world. And we now know that it's commonly occurring in wild bumblebees in the UK. And in the lab, at least, it kills about 25% of the bumblebees it infects, and it's quite common in the wild. So it seems pretty likely that it's probably, our poor bees are suffering from Asian bee diarrhea, which isn't good. And a whole bunch of other diseases have been spread too. So that's diseases, and I won't say any more about those. Loss of habitat is probably actually the biggest driver of our insect declines, and of wildlife declines generally. But from a bumblebee's or a bee's perspective, the really significant habitat loss relates to the loss of flower-rich grasslands. So this is an example of a beautiful flower-rich grassland which still exists. I took this picture in South Uist in the Western Isles. But similar grasslands occur all across Europe, and they used to be very, very common. So we used to have in mainland Britain lots of hay meadows that were kept for producing hay, to produce fodder for livestock in the winter, and they were simply cut for hay once or twice a year, and they were otherwise more or less unmanaged, maybe grazed a little bit. And they developed this beautiful flower community over hundreds of years. So Britain had about 3 million hectares of flower-rich grassland 100 years ago. But we destroyed about 98% of it in the 20th century and replaced it by monocultures of ryegrass or cereals or whatever. And it's pretty obvious that if you sweep this away and replace it with a field of grass, then from a bee's perspective, that's pretty disastrous. Now this is a little bit childish, but you can explore the world by using Google Earth and dropping down into Street View. And it's really quite depressing how much of it looks like this. You can't tell where in the world you are, because whatever the natural vegetation was, whatever flowers used to grow there or trees or whatever, they've been removed and replaced by an endless sea of wheat that stretches to the horizon, or barley, or oilseed rape, or whatever it might be, depending on what country you're in. So this is a quick whistle-stop tour of some beautiful European countries. There we go. Look, I can't remember which are which anymore, but you get the idea. That it's pretty bleak. If you're a biologist, if you're interested in wildlife, if you're interested in nature, then there's not a lot to see in these places. And of course we need to grow crops, we need to feed people. As I've already said, the human population is large and it's growing, and we're going to have 10 or 12 billion people to feed by 2050. And we've accepted this kind of industrial agriculture, fields that get bigger and bigger and bigger every year, with these near-perfect monocultures of crops as the only way we can feed everybody. And I don't think it is, and I don't think it's sustainable, not least because it's wiping out our pollinators. There's a whole bunch of other reasons, but I'm getting off course slightly. I'll not digress any further on that one because it's a completely different talk. Anyway, so that's habitat loss. Then finally, pesticides, which are obviously an intimately linked, integral part of that farming system I was just talking about. In the UK, the number of pesticides applied to each field has doubled in the last 25 years. We currently apply about 16.9 thousand tonnes of pesticides to the UK every year. And we shouldn't therefore be surprised if that's impacting on wildlife. So just to give you one example of one field, this is a field in Sussex where we've been doing some work, and the farmer was very nice and he agreed to tell us what pesticides and other chemicals he was applying to his fields. This is just an example of one oilseed rape field in the south of England that was sown in August 2012 and harvested in June 2013. And these are the different chemicals that were applied to it. There's a couple of fertilisers in there, but 20 different types of pesticides applied to one crop in its growing season, including about 5 different types of insecticide. When I first saw this, I couldn't quite believe it, but he's not a bad farmer, this is normal farming practice. It's not just farmers, that 16.9 thousand tonnes is just farming use, but the pesticides are also used by local authorities, and they're used by us, they're used by most people who have a garden. These days, every garden centre and even supermarkets stock a whole range of different pesticides that you can buy to drench your lawn or your flower beds or wherever you like, with no training. Probably people don't always read the back of the label particularly well. I can't resist putting this in. It just show. So Bayer is a German company that is one of the big makers of agrochemicals and pesticides. And they say the Germans have no sense of humour, but they clearly do. Pre-seeds for bees with your bee-killing insecticide. Anyway, even if you don't use pesticides in your garden, there's a high likelihood you'll be accidentally bringing pesticide into your garden if you buy plants from a garden centre. So we recently did some research on the bee-friendly plants being sold by garden centres, and these are sort of big chains, B&Q and Yvale and so on. We bought flowers from them, and we specifically bought plants that were being sold as bee-friendly. Many of them have the Royal Horticultural Society's Perfect for Pollinator logo on them. And we screened the nectar and the pollen for pesticides, and 70% of them had insecticides in the nectar, in the whole plant. The plants have been drenched, so you see these beautiful plants on sale in the garden centre, and all the leaves, are undamaged, and the blooms look amazing, far better than they'll ever look in your garden, probably, sadly. And it's because they've been drenched in chemicals. And it seems to me really cheeky that garden centres are selling plants as being perfect for pollinators when they're full of insecticide. So beware. There are better play. Well, if you can find an organic garden centre, buy from that, or otherwise rear plants from seed. Just a final thing to warn you about, because maybe you don't use any pesticides, and maybe you're already aware of the pesticides in garden centre plants, but very few people are aware But there is also a danger associated with flea treatments that you might put on your dog or cat. So this is the commonest brand of flea treatment called Advocate, and you're supposed to drip it on the neck of your dog. And its active ingredient is something that you can, if you're very eagle-eyed, you might be able to read the word imidacloprid there. That's a neonicotinoid insecticide. They've been banned for use across Europe in farming because they're so poisonous to bees. The dose of this stuff that you're supposed to drip on your dog every month is enough to kill 60 million honeybees or 60 partridges. It's pretty toxic stuff, and the reason you put it on the neck of your dog is so that the dog can't turn around and lick it and kill itself. But it's a neurotoxin, and I would say maybe you really don't want this on your family pet. So just beware if you have a dog or cat and treat it. Try to avoid products with these neonicotinoids in that are really toxic to the environment generally. Okay, so I told you it was a bit doom and gloom, but we're nearly at the end of that. So to sum up what's happening to bees and probably insects generally, they're being bombarded by all these different things. They could probably cope with one or two pressures. But if they're losing their habitat, they can't find any flowers, and when they do find flowers, they're probably contaminated with pesticides, and they're also suffering from Asian bee diarrhea or some other foreign parasite. And we shouldn't really be surprised if they can't cope with all of that and they end up dying. What we need to avoid is ending up like this. These pictures are taken in China, southwest China, ironically really close to where we think bumblebees first evolved 30 million years ago. But they now have to hand-pollinate their trees because there are no bees. And that's a pretty terrifying prospect. It's hard to imagine British farmers hand-pollinating their oilseed rape fields, so we need to make sure we don't end up there. One possible solution is this. We could build robot bees to replace the bees. There are at least 4 labs in the world that are actively doing this at the moment. These are 2 different prototypes that have been built. They're pretty clumsy looking things, I have to say. I really hope this isn't the future. It seems to me, well, if you think what would it cost to replace bees with little robots, the practicalities of it don't seem to stack up to me. So the honeybee, just one of 20,000 species of bee, there are about 3 trillion honeybees in the world. So we're really going to build 3 trillion little robots. Think of all the plastic and metal and energy and everything else that's going to need, and they're going to break down and need repairing, and we'll end up with them littering the countryside where they're broken down. Or worst case scenario, Vladimir Putin's hackers will break into the bee control system and turn them against us. When we've got real bees that have been pollinating flowers for 120 million years, they're really good at it, and they're biodegradable, and they're self-replicating, and they're carbon neutral, and they seem to have all the properties you would want in a pollinator. So to think we could do better and build our own seems absolutely nuts. But people are trying. So what can we do to make things better for our bees and everything else? Well, the good news is there's loads of stuff that we can do. Lots of these conservation stories are really doom and gloom because you feel helpless about the ice caps melting and the polar bears or the Amazon burning on the news, and it's so depressing in recent weeks watching that. But there is stuff we can do to help our insects close to home, at least. Most obviously by making our gardens and our villages and towns into kind of mini nature reserves, a whole network of them. So there are about 500,000 hectares of gardens in the United Kingdom. And just imagine if most of those were insect friendly. That would provide a huge network of habitat for wildlife. So I just recently written a book about this. Sorry for the blatant book plug in the middle of the talk, but anyway, it came out last month, and if you want to know more about this in detail, buy the book, but I won't plug it any longer. I've also made lots of little YouTube videos that give you tips for things you can do in your garden if you don't want to spend any money. So what can you do? There are a number of things I'm going to quickly run through. First of all, just try to mow less often. Mowing uses petrol. Usually, most of us don't have push mowers anymore. We use something powered that's using fossil fuels one way or another. And we're obsessed by tidiness, aren't we? I don't know why people are, but we are. There are so many people, my dad included, who wants to have a lawn that looks like a Wimbledon tennis court with stripes up and down it, and he's out mowing it every 5 minutes. But it's really pointless and futile activity, really, isn't it? If we just let it go a bit shaggy, stop cutting it, all these flowers appear. This is my lawn, and I haven't planted any flowers in it at all. It's just the plants that were there, they just couldn't flower because they were being mown all the time. But as soon as you stop, all these clovers and buttercups and dandelions and the like just pop up and start flowering, and then bees start visiting them. So mow as little as you can bear. Really simple thing to do. And if we could apply the same to council-owned land, to road verges and roundabouts and parts of public parks and that kind of thing, then there's huge amounts of land. So this picture was taken in Stirling, where I used to be based at the University of Stirling, and there's a campaign group there called On the Verge, who spend their weekends sowing wildflower mixes on any bit of land that they can get their hands on. So there's a road verge, and that's a roundabout. And there are more than 50 of these patches in Stirling at the last count, one in a prison, one next to a rugby pitch, and so on. And again, there's enormous potential to get rid of. You can see in the distance what it used to look like, this boring mown grass that the council would come around every couple of weeks and mow the hell out of. And instead it's a sea of flowers with butterflies and everything else. So much more beautiful. Something else to at least try to aspire to. So my top tip is that you can get rid of all the weeds in your garden in the blink of an eye if you just rename them wildflowers. Because a weed is just a concept that we've invented. And weeds are also usually flowers, dandelions. They're really popular with pollinators. So if you can bear to let them flower, please do. And don't obsessively try to persecute them if you can resist the temptation. Also, when you're buying plants, bear in mind that some plants are rubbish for pollinators and others are good. And that might seem strange because all flowers originally evolved to attract pollinators. That's the point of a flower. If it didn't attract pollinators, the plant would be wasting its time producing petals and so on. But we've messed up flowers over hundreds of years of plant breeding. So breeders have selected for things that they thought were attractive to humans, and in some cases, very often, the end result of that is that they've made the plants unattractive to pollinators. And this is a classic example. This is a kind of wild-type rose, which insects love. This is the sort of hybrid tea rose that you buy from your local garden centre. You might think that that looks pretty, but from a bee's perspective, it is an abomination that should be got rid of. It's actually a mutant. So lots of double varieties are mutants in which the anthers that produce the pollen are instead expressed as extra petals. So it's just a great bundle of petals with no pollen at all. So from a bee's perspective, it's a complete waste of time. So next time you're buying a rose, you can get ones like that, open single roses from garden centres. And if you go for one of those, you'll bring so much more life to your garden. And similarly, lots of annual bedding plants are completely useless for pollinators. So get rid of these hideous things. Sorry, I don't know why the name is there. Anyway. And grow instead. I'm just going to give you a very few examples, but as I say, there's lots of YouTube videos that show you lots more examples of things you might grow. So things like catmint and geraniums, proper geraniums, not those horrible pelargonium things, but proper geraniums. Borage and lavender, of course, and comfrey is a fantastic bee plant. This is a nice picture I was sent of a. So some bees bees have different length tongues, and some bumblebees have really long tongues and visit deep flowers. The great yellow bumblebee is an example of a bee with a long tongue that likes to visit deep flowers, and some have short tongues and can't visit deep flowers. But some of them with short tongues cheat by biting holes in the sides of the flowers. And so comfrey is a deep flower that needs a long tongue to reach the nectar. But somebody has bitten a hole here, and this bee actually isn't the culprit. It didn't bite the hole. This species has weak mandibles and can't bite holes, but it looks for the holes that have been bitten by one of the other species that has sharp mandibles, and then it sucks the nectar, which is just here, out of the flower. Anyway, nectar robbing. That's completely incidental, but it's quite fun. So grow the right kinds of flowers. There are lots of also beautiful wildflowers you might consider growing in your garden. Those are just a few examples, because all flowers were wildflowers once. Plant flowering trees. Trees can support many more flowers generally than the same area of herbaceous border. So if you've got room, put in something that will attract pollinators, and better still, plant something that also produces fruit for yourself. Your own homegrown 0 food miles apples or pears or whatever. So there's lots of fruit trees that are really attractive to pollinators in the spring, and also productive too. So, and by growing trees, you're locking up carbon, so everyone wins. Don't use any pesticides, obviously. I won't labour this anymore, but you really don't need to use pesticides in your garden. I don't. I know lots of people that don't, and manage to grow lots of beautiful flowers and vegetables without them. It's just no need. Don't buy peat-based compost. Most composts on sale in garden centres in the UK are still based on peat, which is a fossil fuel, essentially. It's a massive store of carbon locked up in the ground, and also in most of a relatively rare habitat. Lowland peat bogs in particular are where most peat comes from, and lowland peat bogs are rare habitats now, partly because we've dug most of them up. So you're basically destroying a carbon store. As soon as the peat comes out of the ground and the air gets to it, it starts to oxidise and turn into carbon dioxide. So it's absolutely crazy that we still use peat-based composts in our gardens, especially when there are lots of alternatives that aren't peat-based and are much more sustainable. So a really simple thing to do. Ideally, make your own compost. People seem to have forgotten that the stuff that you make in a compost bin is basically the same as the stuff you might buy in a big plastic bag from the garden centre, but it's perfectly possible to make your own potting compost if you can be bothered. You might also make a bee hotel. Now, I realised about 2 hours ago that this is possibly completely pointless in Orkney, because I don't know if there are any bees that use them. Does anyone know if there's any bees that use bee hotels here? I don't think there are, no. Anyway, should you be planning to move a little further south, then a bee hotel is a nice thing to put up. These are for the solitary bees, the ones that nest in little holes. This horrible ugly thing is a post I drilled some holes in my garden. It doesn't look very pretty, but it does have in this case, red mason bees nesting in it, and leafcutter bees. I showed you those earlier. There's one cutting the leaves. And you can get some really nice, you can make rather pretty ones, better than my ugly fence post, or buy ones with little windows on the side, and these are great for kids, just because you can see what's going on inside. So you take this little window off, and this is what you see. And these are little cells with a pile of pollen and developing grubs, baby bees, with little clay walls that the bees build between them. But sadly, you won't get to see any of these things because you live in the wrong place. Sorry. Never mind. You could try making instead, this could work here. I don't know if anyone's tried it in Orkney, but you have some of the species. These aren't bees, but I'm just sticking this in because it's a fun little project you can do in your garden to encourage wildlife. You can make a hoverfly lagoon. Sounds rather glamorous, but it's basically just any waterproof container, an old milk bottle with the top chopped off will do. These are some in my garden, these are old buckets and things. Fill it with water and put a load of organic material, lawn clippings or sawdust or whatever you like in. We're experimenting to see what works best. And with a bit of luck, you'll get these beautiful hoverflies coming and laying eggs in there, which hatch into these gloriously repulsive maggots with long tails, called rat-tailed maggots, which kids love. And the tail is actually a breathing tube that gets, so they can get oxygen while living underneath the soupy water eating bacteria. And these hoverflies are great pollinators as well, so well worth encouraging in your garden. Okay, so I'm nearly finished. I've talked primarily about bees, and I think bees are a good starting point for engaging people, because that message has got across. People have finally woken up to the fact that bees are declining and that bees are important. But it isn't just bees that are important. We need to look after everything. We need to look after all the insects and other creepy crawlers and the whole environment better than we have done so far. So we need dung beetles and the hoverflies I just mentioned, and ladybirds, and earwigs are really good biocontrol agents, and worms to keep the soil healthy, and all the rest of it. Woodlice in the compost heaps helping to break down organic material and stuff. You know, you can buy, I saw this being advertised, you can buy woodlice killer from online and from some garden centres. Why on earth would you want to kill woodlice? Don't understand. Anyway, we should be looking after all of these creatures, but maybe bees are a starting point for engaging people, for thinking about this. This is a bit of a cheesy way to finish, but this is it. This is where we live. There is no planet B. We're not going to be jetting off to live on Mars or anywhere. And I just don't understand why we're not looking after it better than we are at present. I think it's extremely likely that our kids are going to grow up in a world where a world that's lost most of its beauty and most of its natural resources. And I find it really strange because people would do anything for their kids apart from apparently leave them a decent planet to live on. So let's try and do better, and we can start by looking after the insects that live in our gardens. Thank you very much for listening.
We've got time for questions. There'll be a lot.
Shout.
Yes, sir.
Yes, you go first.
What's the difference between a bee, a fly, and a wasp?
So, bees evolved from wasps. Bees and wasps are closely related. Bees are sort of wasps turned vegetarian, if you like. So they're quite hard to distinguish, and technically the only way to be certain of distinguishing them is to look for the branched hairs that I mentioned, which wasps never have, but you need a microscope, really. They are quite hard to separate, whereas flies are really easy to tell apart. For one, flies only have one pair of wings, whereas bees and wasps have two pairs of wings. It's not always that obvious, but they do, so count the wings. And also the antennae. Most flies have almost microscopic, tiny, short antennae, whereas bees and wasps have very obvious long antennae. So you should be able to, at least those mimics that I showed you at the beginning, the ones that are flies, when you know what to look for, you can spot them quite easily.
Thank you.
Lady down here. Okay.
It's getting on for 50 years since I used any poisons in my garden, and as you say, I've been quite successful. But I do buy in plants from places like Tesco or Lidl or wherever. And you said earlier on that they had been grown with unsuitable chemicals.
Yeah.
Do they disappear over time?
It depends enormously on the chemicals. Some go much quicker than others. So some disappear within a few weeks, some within a few years. But they all do degrade over time. If you've already bought plants, I really wouldn't recommend ripping them out or anything. But just be aware that if you do buy one of these beautiful plants from a garden centre, that it might well contain, chances are it will contain insecticides and other fungicides and so on. So the best thing to do is, there are mail order organic nurseries. If you grow from seed, or do plant swaps with friends and neighbours who don't use pesticides themselves, those are much more sustainable ways of getting hold of plants than, people think gardening is a green activity, but if your idea of gardening is to drive to a garden centre and buy a plant that's been grown in peat in a disposable plastic pot and drenched in pesticides, then actually it's not really very green at all, is it? But we don't need to buy those fancy plants. There are other ways of getting hold of them generally.
Thank you. I was intrigued a few years ago to discover that the red-tailed bumblebee had once existed in Orkney in the 19th century in the Edwardian times. So there's a reference in Herbert Sladen's book, The Humblebee. which no, it's now gone, but it's creeping, I think, slowly up the east coast.
Yeah.
So perhaps it'll be part of Orkney's bee fauna again, but it sort of begs the
I
question.
didn't know it had ever lived here. It has a weird distribution because they also occur on Colin Tyree, I believe.
Yeah.
Which is miles from, or was miles from the rest of their distribution.
Well, I mean, I've thought about it, and I just wondered if it was something to do with the sort of forage crops that were being grown then to encourage, soil fertility like lupins and.
I don't know.
A Russian comfrey was widely grown in the 19th century as a fodder crop, and so that might have been, a factor. But it just begs the question, what's driving changes in, our bee fauna? I mean, is it climate change? Or
I think most people think, certainly there is really good evidence that climate change has already had a measurable impact on bumblebees. So there's good evidence that the southern edges of quite a lot of species have shifted northwards, and there's a few species where the northern edges have also shifted northwards. So the buff-tailed bumblebee, I gather, has just arrived relatively recently here, which was barely found north of central Scotland only just a few years ago. So there does seem to be a general creeping northwards, but there are probably other factors involved too.
Thanks very much.
Any more? Up there at the top. I could just add, and from my knowledge of bumblebees, that the red-tailed disappeared in about 1950-ish.
Right.
The specimens in the National Museum in Scotland captured in point.
Yeah. So it might come back.
So you're talking a lot about things like community projects to bring back flowers and what we can do ourselves. Is there any examples of sort of government level changes that are pro-bee, that are pro-insects coming back? Is there anything like that, not even in the UK, in the world, that you can think of, or is it purely just kind of
there's lots of hot air. I mean, Obama, bless him, they created a pollinator strategy for the United States when he was in power. I don't think much happened to it, and clearly under the current regime nothing will be happening. The UK obviously is in, where do we start? Michael Gove was making a lot of noise about redirecting all farm subsidies to the delivery of public goods, as he put it, whatever that means. But we already have these agri-environment schemes, which is basically, I guess that's the biggest government-funded scheme to support biodiversity in general. And that's, in the UK, we were spending about 400 million a year on agri-environment schemes. And he was talking about potentially greatly increasing that, but then of course, he's no longer Environment Secretary, and Lord knows what will happen next politically. So we're really up in the air. If we do stay in Europe, then the Common Agricultural Policy, I'm pro-Europe, but I do think the Common Agricultural Policy has been a complete disaster. It's basically driven the sort of industrialisation of agriculture for 50 years. And it would be nice, that would be the one good thing about leaving, would be that in theory, if we had a benign government, which was unlikely, then they could use all those farm subsidies for good, to do good things. But I think they almost certainly won't, even so. Yeah. Elsewhere in the world, I'm struggling to think of anything terribly good. Most governments are now aware that insects are in some kind of decline, that bees are declining, and so they're starting to kind of produce policy documents and the like, but they're not actually doing very much generally.
Down here.
A question really about, not about bees, but about wasps. Because a lot of folk will say that they like bees, but they can't stand wasps. And a lot of children will say they love bumblebees, and they'll try and, feed them if they see them looking sleepy and so on. So I usually defend wasps as well by saying they're pollinators too. But would you have any kind of really interesting facts about wasps that I can
Yeah, I know. So you can try and justify. I mean, I'm often asked, what good are wasps? What good are mosquitoes? What good are slugs? Mozzies? Whatever. Yeah. And you can say, well, wasps, they're biocontrol agents. They eat lots of caterpillars and they eat aphids and so on. So they're actually quite beneficial in lots of ways, as well as also being pollinators. But I think that's missing the point slightly. Things don't have to have a value to us to be worth looking after. You know, surely wasps just deserve to live here as much as we do. And I kind of find it's a bit sad that we only value things for what they do for us. We need to kind of get past that, I think.
Over here.
Can you give an idea of what is the scale of the problem that we would need to do to fix the problem of the decline of bees? I mean, you know, you hear about programs like along the side of highways now, you grow wildlife, you're talking about, you know, better gardening methods and things like that. And they all sound great. You think, okay, well, I'm able to grow bees in my backyard, therefore I'm saving the world. But really, how big is the problem? What would really have to be done so we shift the trend?
I honestly, I don't think anyone could answer that question. We don't really know how much habitat we need to put back to reverse these declines. My strategy is to just try and push for as much as we possibly can, because we're almost certainly going to fall short of what we need. But we don't know. We don't understand the natural world anywhere near as well as we might. You know, it's really complicated. There are thousands of interacting species in even quite a simple kind of ecosystem like a meadow. And we really have a pretty rubbish understanding of how the natural world works. So we can't say, you know, if we put in X thousand hectares, that would be enough. We honestly just don't really know. But clearly we should stop destroying habitat, and where we can, we should try and restore it. And we need to try and find a way of growing food that also supports nature at the same time, rather than seeing them as kind of... At the moment, the way we produce food is largely makes land inhospitable to life, and I don't think it has to be that way. But the sort of current system of really heavy reliance on lots of chemicals and big monoculture cropping, I don't think is where we should go, but it's probably a story for another day.
Any more questions? Over here in the middle.
If you had to pick one flower to put in your garden, which would it be?
Ooh.
What's the best one?
Well, I actually, the ones I showed are probably, I was torn as to which ones to show. I'd probably go, if you want one that's pretty, catmint, flowers for ages, and you get loads of different bees visit it. But comfrey's fantastic too. So yeah, both of those. But there are loads of others. Yeah, watch some of my videos where I wander around my garden pointing at all the nice flowers, and if you want inspiration. But yeah, start with those two.
Are we doing for time?
Minutes.
Couple of minutes. Down here, in the front.
Do you get much backlash from the industry for speaking out?
Yeah, they don't like me very much.
What's the obvious of that?
There are some bloggers, the online folk that you encounter in Twitter and the like, who basically try to discredit me completely, claim I'm a charlatan, that I'm paid for by the green blob or whatever, that I'm basically just do what anyone will pay me to say, whatever anyone will pay me to say, that I'm completely corrupt and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, they do their best.
And funding?
It's quite, I find it hard to get funding from government research councils these days because they've always got industry reps on the panel, but thankfully there are other charitable funders that still give me money. But it is challenging. I mean, it's worse. It's much better in the UK and in Europe, I think, than in the US. In the US, well, people have been forced out of their jobs if they, spoke out too much. Their industry seems to have a real stranglehold on the universities, whereas here we don't get that.
And would you not imagine to get a lot of support from like beekeeping organizations?
But they don't have that. I mean, yes, moral support, but not. Although I do upset beekeepers sometimes too, because you can have too many bees, too many honeybees in one place. There is evidence that if you have too many hives, that's harmful to wild bees, and not every beekeeper likes that message.
Okay, I think we've got to finish. Just before I thank David, I realised I didn't say who I was. I'm not used to this kind of business, and it's very glaring. John Crossley, and I'm representing today the Orkney Field Club, and this talk was given in association with the Orkney Field Club, which is 60 years old this year, and we study all sorts of nature, including bumblebees, and so we have lots of events and talks and so on, so hopefully people can come and see what we do, or even join us if they like us. Anyway, Dave, that was entertaining, inspirational, fascinating. I'm running out of adjectives. But I'm sure we're going to go away today, and most of us, and think, we can garden in a different way, and it's going to be much more interesting than being all neat and tidy. Thank you very much, Dave.